I had 6 months to live, or so we all thought. My estranged family flooded back in. I watched them finally tell the truth about me. Then the second opinion came back clean. There is a specific kind of clarity that arrives when a doctor tells you that you are dying. I've heard people describe it as peace, as terror, as a narrowing of everything down to what actually matters. What I felt, sitting in Dr. Alderman's office on a Friday afternoon in March with the particular afternoon light coming through the Venetian blinds in thin, pale strips, was something I didn't have a name for at the time and have since decided to call permission. Permission to stop managing how I appeared to people. Permission to stop performing okayness at family events I'd been attending alone for 3 years. Permission to stop being the version of myself that had been shaped over decades by people who needed me to be smaller than I was so they could feel comfortable around me. Permission, finally, to simply be what I was, which was, according to a scan and a biopsy and the careful, compassionate voice of a man I'd met twice, a person with approximately 6 months to live. I want to tell you the full story. Not just the part everyone reacts to, which is the second opinion, the clean result, the diagnosis that turned out to be wrong in the most profound and life-rearranging way a diagnosis can be wrong, but the part before it, the years before March. The specific shape of the family I'd been estranged from and why, and what they did when they thought the estrangement was about to be resolved by the one thing that resolves all estrangements eventually, death. My name is Renata. I'm 41 years old. I grew up in a large, loud, Mediterranean family that expressed love through food and criticism in roughly equal measure, and which had, by the time I was in my mid-30s, sorted itself into a configuration that I found unsustainable. My parents, both alive, both in their late 60s, both operating with the confident authority of people who have never seriously examined whether they might be wrong about anything, had always treated me as the family's cautionary tale. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just as a matter of ongoing gentle disappointment that had calcified over the years into something closer to identity. My sister Carla was the success story. Carla is 4 years older than me, a pediatric surgeon, married with 3 children, the possessor of a home that photographs well, and a life that my parents referenced in conversation with a specific frequency of people who are making a point. My brother Dom is 2 years older than me, and while his life is less curated than Carla's, he had the distinct advantage of being male and firstborn adjacent in a family where both of those things were quietly scored. I was the youngest, the one who'd moved to a different city, who'd chosen a career in landscape architecture that my father called gardening with a degree, who'd never married, who'd never produced children, who'd never done the things the family's internal logic said were the benchmarks of a life going correctly. I had also, 3 years before the diagnosis, stopped attending family events. This wasn't a dramatic exit. There was no screaming confrontation, no ultimatum, no single incident that I could point to and say, that was the moment. It was more gradual than that, a slow accumulation of dinners where I sat at a table of people who shared my blood and felt a loneliness more acute than anything I felt living alone, of phone calls where my mother asked leading questions about my relationship status with the persistence of someone performing concern while actually performing judgment, of Christmas gatherings where Carla's children received attention on a scale that made visible, by contrast, how little space there was in the family's emotional vocabulary for the kind of life I had built. I had tried, for years, to be the person they could see. Eventually I stopped trying, and then eventually I stopped going. My parents called this Renata's difficulty. As in, Renata has always had difficulty. With what, exactly, was never specified, because in my family things that cannot be resolved are best discussed in the passive voice, attributed to a vague constitutional flaw rather than to anything specific that anyone could be accountable for. I had a full life outside of it. Friends who were chosen rather than inherited, a career I loved, an apartment in a city I'd moved to deliberately, full of plants and books and the accumulated texture of a person who knows how to be alone without being lonely. I had a therapist named Frances who had helped me understand the specific damage that conditional love does to a person's ability to trust their own perceptions, and I had done enough work in her office to understand, most of the time, that the problem was not that I was difficult. Most of the time. The diagnosis came after months of symptoms that I'd attributed to stress, and then to my age, and then to the particular stubbornness of someone who prefers not to be the person sitting in a doctor's office hearing things they don't want to hear. Fatigue, which I have always had some version of. Pain, which I managed. A scan in January that showed something that needed a biopsy, and the biopsy in February, and then the Friday in March with the Venetian blinds. Dr. Alderman was good at this. I say that without irony. There is a skill in delivering devastating news, and he had it. He was precise without being cold, compassionate without being performative. He used clear language. He answered my questions. He gave me the names of specialists and the timeline as he understood it and the options available, which were not none but were also not what anyone would choose. He said 6 months, possibly more with treatment, possibly more without. This was the kind of thing where the range was wide and the variables were significant, and no one, he said, should take any number as absolute. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with my hands around the mug, and I did the thing I did in moments of serious information. I sat with it until it became real, which took about 2 hours, after which I cried for about 40 minutes, and then I stopped, and I made more tea, and I began, in the methodical way I approach most things, to think about what came next. The first decision was the one I want to tell you about, because it's the one that led to everything else. I decided to tell my family. Not because I wanted comfort from them. I had friends for that. I had Francis. I had the particular community of people I'd spent 3 years building a life with after walking away from the one I'd been born into. But because Francis had said to me in a session about 6 months before the diagnosis, when we were talking about the estrangement and what I still carried from it. What do you still want from them? Not what you expected, not what you deserved. What do you still want? And I had answered, after a long time, with something I hadn't said out loud before. I want to know if they ever actually saw me. I want to know if there's a version of me that existed for them beyond the Renata they needed me to be. I hadn't known, at the time, how to create the conditions for that answer. But sitting at my kitchen table on a Friday in March with a 6-month diagnosis and the particular permission of someone who has been told the clock is running, I thought, the conditions exist now. People say things to the dying that they don't say to the living. Not because they suddenly become honest, but because they think there are no more consequences. When someone is dying, the stakes of the conversation feel different. Confession becomes possible because confession to a dying person costs nothing. You can say what's true and still have all the years ahead of you to go back to behaving exactly as you did before. I was going to let them say it. I was going to tell them I was dying, and I was going to watch them decide what to do with that. And at the end of it, I would have my answer. I would know whether there was a version of me that existed for them, or whether the Renata they'd always had was the only Renata they were capable of seeing. I called my mother on a Sunday. She answered with a particular voice she used for my calls. Not unwarm, but measured. Always slightly ready to be disappointed. I told her I had something serious to tell her. I told her about the diagnosis, in the clear, factual way I decided to use, without drama and without the particular performance of pathos that the news might have supported. I heard her go very quiet on the other end of the line. And then she said, in a voice I hadn't heard from her in a very long time, a voice stripped of the management and the measurement, something more like a person than a mother performing a role. Renata? Just my name. Just that. I said I was okay. I said I had good doctors. I said I wanted to see everyone, that I was ready to do that the last few years of distance felt different now, and I wanted the time I had left to be spent differently. All of which was true, in its way, because whatever my reasons for the experiment, the desire underneath it was real. I did want to know. I had always wanted to know. The experiment was just the mechanism I'd constructed around a very genuine, very old longing. She said they would come. She said, of course, immediately, without consulting anyone, in the voice of a woman who has just been given information that has temporarily suspended all of her usual operating protocols and left her with nothing but instinct. Of course they would come. Of course. They came the following weekend. All of them. My parents, Carla and her husband Marco, Dom and his wife Sylvia, even my Aunt Filomena, who was my mother's older sister and who had always been present at every significant family event like a kind of warm, opinionated weather system. They came to my city, to my apartment, which they had never visited in 3 years of estrangement. My mother walked through the front door and looked around at the plants and the books and the particular organized aliveness of the space I'd built, and I watched something move across her face that I couldn't quite read. I had thought about this gathering for a week, about how I would be, how much of the experiment I would reveal in the way I behaved. What I decided was nothing. I would simply be as I was. I would not perform illness. I was not in any visible way very sick, yet the symptoms were manageable. I looked essentially like myself. I would not perform stoicism. I would simply be Renata, in my apartment, with my family, and I would pay attention. The first evening was careful. There was food. My mother had brought enough to feed several times our number, which is how she processes emotion, and I received it without comment and set it out on the table and let the cooking be what it was, which was love in the only language she'd ever been fully fluent in. We ate. Dom made jokes that landed a little flat because everyone was performing a version of normal that the circumstances made impossible to sustain. Carla sat close to me at the table, which she hadn't done at family events in years, and refilled my glass without being asked, and kept looking at me with an expression I understood to be grief beginning. The apartment that night was full of people sleeping in configurations that required creativity. My parents in the bedroom, Carla and Marco on the sofa bed I'd borrowed from a neighbor, Dom and Sylvia in Carla's old sleeping bag on the living room floor, Aunt Philomena in the armchair because she insisted she slept sitting up and always had. I lay in my study on a camp bed I'd set up, listening to the sounds of my apartment full of my family, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, a completely genuine, uncomplicated gratitude for them being there. Whatever the reasons they'd come, they were there. My mother was in my bed. My brother was on my floor. After 3 years of an estrangement that had hollowed out something in me even as it protected something in me, they were here. The real conversation started on the second day. It began with Dom, which surprised me, because Dom has always been the one most likely to handle difficult things by not handling them. He found me in the kitchen on Saturday morning while everyone else was still sleeping or slow-moving, and he sat down across from me with a cup of coffee and looked at me for a moment with the face of someone who has been awake for longer than he slept. "I need to tell you something," he said. I looked at him. "Okay. When you stopped coming to things 3 years ago, I didn't call you. I kept thinking I would, and I didn't." He turned the mug in his hands. I told myself it was because I didn't know what to say. But that wasn't it. It was because if I called you, I'd have to say something about why you'd stopped coming, and saying something about that meant saying something about, he stopped, about how things are, with Mom and Dad. And I didn't want to do that because it would mean looking at it, and I didn't want to look at it. I waited. "The gardening comment," he said. "Dad's been saying that for years. Gardening with a degree." I never said anything. I laughed, once. I don't know why I laughed. He looked up at me. "It's not gardening. What you do." I looked it up. I actually looked it up. I know it took me until now. That's the point. And I read about some of the projects you've worked on, and it's not gardening. It's extraordinary, actually. The park redesign you did he named the project. One I was proud of. One that had won an award 3 years ago that I had told no one in my family about because there was no version of telling them that didn't feel like begging for the recognition they'd decided long ago not to give. "I saw that," he said. "It's extraordinary." I looked at my brother across my kitchen table. He had his father's face in his mother's hands, and he had never, in 41 years of being my older brother, said anything to me that required this much of him to say. "Thank you," I said. Quietly. "I should have said it earlier," he said. "I should have said a lot of things earlier." Carla came later. She found me on the balcony in the afternoon, where I'd gone to water the plants. I have a lot of plants on the balcony, a source of ongoing private pleasure, and she leaned against the railing next to me, and for a while we just looked at the street below without talking, the way we used to sit when we were teenagers, and one of us was in some minor crisis, and the other one was there without needing to make it a production. Then she said, "I think I've been jealous of you for years, and I've never admitted that to anyone, including myself." I looked at her. "You left," she said. You left. The family, the city, the whole thing. You looked at what was expected, and you said no, and you went, and built something else. And I couldn't do that. I don't know if that's because I didn't want to, or because I wasn't brave enough, or because I actually wanted what I built, and I genuinely don't know which one it is, but I know that watching you do it from a distance and calling it Renata's difficulty was easier than asking myself why I couldn't. She paused. I was the one who said that. By the way, first, to Mom and Dad, Renata has always had difficulty. I said it first, and they repeated it. She looked at me. I'm sorry for that. I'm really sorry. I thought, standing on my balcony with my watering can, about the 14 years since Carla had first deployed that phrase, about the family dinners where it had floated in the air, about the specific way it had shaped, over repetition, into something that everyone accepted as simply true. Renata, difficult, always had been something in her constitution that didn't quite fit. That's just how she is. It was 13 words from my sister. I'm sorry for that.
I'm really sorry.
But those 13 words were more than the sum of the years they were accounting for, and I stood on my balcony and let them land.
My father was the last.
He was always going to be the last because he was the one it would cost the most, and he was the one I both most needed it from and least expected it from. He is a man who was raised in a tradition of fathers who provided and therefore loved, for whom the expression of a feeling required it to first be translated into an action, and for whom the action of love had always been provision. Money when I needed it, the apartment, the degree, the practical infrastructure of a life. And who had perhaps never understood that the thing being asked of him was not infrastructure, but witness. He came to the balcony after Carla had gone in. He stood next to me without speaking for a while, looking at the street with his hands in his pockets. He was older than I'd been letting myself see. The years had settled into him in the way they settle into people in their late 60s, the particular heaviness of a body that has been carrying the weight of a long life. I felt a love for him that was tangled and old and unresolved and still somehow completely present. The park, he said eventually, using the name of the project Dom had mentioned, which meant Dom had said something to him. I looked at pictures. When? Last night.
Couldn't sleep.
I got my phone out and I looked. He was quiet. It's beautiful, Renata. What you made. I didn't say anything. I didn't understand, he said. What it was you were doing. I thought, he stopped. Started again. I thought landscape was, I thought it was decorative. Something supplementary. Not a thing that stands on its own. I know, I said. That was my failure of imagination, he said. Not your failure of anything. He said it carefully, like someone reading from a prepared text, which meant he had been preparing it. He had been awake last night with his phone looking at pictures of my work, and he had been preparing what he would say to me. That preparation was its own thing. That preparation was the most my father knew how to do, and he had done it. You built something real, he said. I should have seen it sooner. He didn't say I'm sorry. Not in those words. But he said I should have seen it sooner, which is the closest that man will ever come, and I received it as what it was, which was a very large thing from a very stubborn person, and I let it be enough. My Aunt Philomena, who had been present through all of this with the serene observational quality of a woman who has seen enough of families to know that what they do in crisis reveals more about them than anything they do in comfort, cornered me in the kitchen on the last morning and held my face in her hands and looked at me and said, "You are always the most interesting one. I hope you know I've always known that." I didn't know, I said. I should have said it more loudly, she said. The loud ones in families always need to be louder. She was referring, we both understood, to herself. I'll be louder from now on. They left on Sunday afternoon. My mother was the last to go. She stood at the front door with her coat already on, and she held me for a long time, longer than she'd held me since I was a child, the specific hold of a person who is leaving someone they're afraid of losing. I let her hold me. I felt, in her arms, the complexity of a love that had never been simple and had also never been absent, love that had been badly expressed, badly translated, transmitted through the wrong channels for most of my life, but love nonetheless, residing in the same person as all the damage, because people are not one thing, and my mother is not one thing, and love is not one thing, and I am 41 years old, and I know this now in a way I didn't always. She pulled back. She held my face like Philomena had. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her in so long I'd stopped expecting to see it. A clear look, direct, stripped of management. I see you, she said. 3 words. I see you. The thing I'd told Francis, 6 months before the diagnosis, was the thing I still wanted from them. After they left, I sat on the floor of my living room for a long time. Not dramatically, just sat, the way I sit when I have a lot to process and need to be low to the ground to do it. The apartment was very quiet in the specific way it is when it has just been full of people and is now empty again. A resonant quiet rather than a vacant one. I sat in it, and I let the weekend settle around me, and I thought about what I had. I had my answers. That's what I'd said I wanted. And I had them. Not perfect answers. My father had not wept and fallen to his knees and given me the kind of cinematic absolution that the situation, if it were a movie, might have produced. My mother had not articulated years of mismanaged love into a clean, comprehensive apology. But they had done what they could do, each of them, and what they could do was more than I had believed them capable of, and that gap between what I'd expected and what actually happened was where I found something I hadn't anticipated. I found that I still loved them. I'd known this abstractly for years, known that the estrangement was not the absence of love, but the necessary protection of it, the decision to love from a distance rather than destroy the love by staying close under conditions that damaged it. But I felt it differently now. More fully, as a thing I could be present with rather than a thing I had to manage from behind glass. The second opinion had been scheduled for 2 weeks after the initial diagnosis. This was Dr. Alderman's suggestion. He'd said, with the directness I'd come to appreciate in him, that with something of this nature a second opinion was not a sign of distrust, but a standard of good medical practice, and that he would be surprised if I didn't seek one, and that he had a colleague he'd be glad to recommend. The appointment was at a larger teaching hospital 40 minutes from my city. I'd made it before the family weekend. I went on a Tuesday, in the particular weather of a late March morning that can't decide between winter and spring. The specialist was a woman named Dr. Chen. She reviewed everything, the scans, the biopsy, the pathology reports, the full file from Dr. Alderman, with a thoroughness that required 2 appointments and an additional scan, the second of which happened the following week. I went alone to both. I told no one because telling people would require explaining what I was doing, and I wasn't ready to explain it until I had something to explain. The results came on a Friday. Also afternoon. Also Venetian blinds, though these were horizontal rather than vertical, which I noticed with the irrelevant observational clarity that high-stakes moments seemed to produce. Dr. Chen sat across from me and said, with the specific, careful gravity of someone who is delivering news that contradicts someone else's news and understands the weight of that, I want to go through this with you carefully because the findings are significantly different from what you were told in March. I looked at her. The initial biopsy result was affected by a processing error in the lab, she said. The tissue was misidentified. What Dr. Alderman was reading was not what he believed he was reading.
She paused.
The additional scans we've done show no malignancy. The symptoms you've been experiencing are consistent with a condition that is serious but treatable, manageable with medication and monitoring. We'll want to keep a close eye on things going forward, but Renata, you are not dying. Not from this. Not now. I sat in that chair for a very long time. Dr. Chun was, like Dr. Alderman, good at her job. She gave me time. She answered questions. She explained what would come next, the treatment for the actual condition, the monitoring schedule, the process of communicating the correction to Dr. Alderman, the practical architecture of what followed a misdiagnosis. She was thorough and clear, and she looked at me with the eyes of someone who understood that she was not only delivering medical information, but something that was going to require significant recalibration in a person who had spent 6 weeks reorganizing their entire interior life around a different set of facts. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with my hands around the mug in what I was realizing was my standard posture for receiving seismic information. I sat there for a long time, and what I sat with was not relief, exactly, or not only relief.
It was something more complicated than that.
I was not dying, which was the most significant fact available to me, and which my body understood before my mind did, in the way bodies do, a loosening a long exhale, something returning to its correct position after weeks of being held wrong. I was not dying. This was everything. But I had also spent 6 weeks living as if I was, and in that living I had received things I would not have received otherwise. My brother, awake in my kitchen at 7 in the morning with a coffee and a prepared honesty. My sister on the balcony with the admission she'd never made. My father with his phone in the dark, looking at pictures of my work, constructing what he would say. My mother at the front door, holding my face. I see you. 3 words from a person who had spent decades looking in my general direction without quite landing. None of that unhappens because I don't die. None of that goes back. I told Frances first. She is my therapist, and she was with me in the room, in a sense, for all of it, for the diagnosis and the decision and the family weekend and the waiting for the second opinion. And she deserved to know first, or at least first among people who hadn't contributed to the situation. Her response, after a long moment of clear relief, was characteristically Frances. How are you sitting with it? The 2 things together. The news that you're not dying, and what happened while you thought you were. Carefully, I said. I'm sitting with it very carefully. What does carefully look like? Like not rushing to a conclusion about what it means, I said. Like letting it be complicated for a while instead of deciding what it is. She nodded. What are you going to do about your family? This was the question. The one that had been running underneath everything since I'd driven home from Dr. Chen's office. What are you going to do? They had said what they said because they believed the conversation was finite, because confession to a dying person has no morning after, no next dinner, no accumulation of future moments in which what you've said has to coexist with how you behave. They had opened, each of them, because they thought the opening cost nothing. Now, the opening was going to have a morning after. Now there were going to be future dinners, future phone calls, future family events, a whole ongoing life in which what had been said in my apartment on a March weekend was going to have to find its place alongside how things had always been and how they might now, possibly, become. What was I going to do? I thought about it for 2 weeks before I did anything. I am, as I've said, a methodical person, and the methodical thing was to sit with it long enough to know what I actually wanted rather than what the moment suggested. I thought about Dom at the kitchen table and whether the honesty of a man facing his sister's death would survive the ordinariness of a Sunday phone call. I thought about Carlo on the balcony and whether the admission she'd made, the jealousy, the phrase she'd started, the apology, was a permanent shift or a grief-induced opening that would close back up as the grief faded. I thought about my father with his phone in the dark, looking at pictures of my park, assembling what he would say to a daughter he thought was dying. And I decided at the end of the 2 weeks that I wasn't going to decide for them. That's the part of the story that I think will frustrate some people because there's an expectation, reasonable, understandable, that a story like this has a verdict. Either the family's crisis honesty was real and the relationship transforms, or it wasn't and you go back to the estrangement knowing what you know. Either you forgive them or you don't. Either the seeing was genuine or it was only possible in the presence of death and evaporates when death is removed. What I decided was that I wasn't going to answer that question for them. I was going to call them, tell them I wasn't dying, correct the information I had given them because they deserved the truth, and also because I was not a person who could sustain a fiction, not with people I was actually in the process of wanting back, and then I was going to see what they did with what remained. I called Dom first. He answered on the second ring. I told him about the second opinion, the misdiagnosis, the lab error, the fact that I was not dying and was going to be okay. He was silent for several seconds, and then I heard a sound that I think was him putting the phone briefly against his chest, and then he came back and he said, in a voice that was several things at once, "Oh, thank God. Renata, thank God." And then, after a moment, "I meant what I said. In the kitchen. That's not something I said because I thought I was losing you. I need you to know that." "Okay," I said. "I should have been saying it for years," he said. "I'm going to keep saying it." Carla cried. She is not a crier. Carla is a pediatric surgeon, and she has the particular controlled effect of someone who has learned to be useful in emergencies, and hearing her cry on the other end of the phone while she processed the news of my survival was its own kind of undoing. When she stopped, she said, "I need you to know that none of what I said was eulogy. None of it was me trying to make peace before the end. It was true." "I believe you," I said. "Good," she said, "because I'm going to be a different kind of sister. I'm putting it on record." My father said very little. He said, "You're going to be okay." And then, after a pause that contained more than I've always expected pauses from him to contain, "I'm glad. I'm so glad." And then, quietly, in a voice that surprised me with its nakedness, "Don't disappear again. I know why you did. I understand why you did. But don't. I told him I wouldn't. And I meant it with a specific